So here's the story. Jesus being crucified, and they say, they nail a sign under them, this is the King of the Jews. Now, we got to pause the story there and ask, was Jesus a real person? Because there are there are a variety of versions out there on was Jesus actually real. So, Julian, give us the first fact. Was Jesus a myth, or was he a man? Was he real?
Yeah, and this is an interesting question because it really depends on where you get your information from. If you go on the internet and if you start Googling for it, you will soon get the impression that Jesus is probably only some kind of myth. But then if you ask people that actually know what they're talking about, scholars that have invested their lives into researching these kind of things, people with PhDs and people who have published in the relevant journals and the magazines, so the academic people really that investigate the historical facts and so on, and they will tell you unanimously that Jesus was a real person. And I think if we approach that kind of question, we need to approach it the way we would approach it with any other person. So if you want to know, say, for example, if Alexander the Great existed, what would you do? I mean, you would probably, because that was in a time before photography or videos existed, so how could you know that Alexander the Great existed? And the answer is you would probably see if there's somebody who lived around his time and maybe wrote something about him. It would be good if there was more than one person who wrote about him. It would be really good if we found somebody who hated Alexander and wrote about him. So you see, those are the kind of criteria that are being applied when you try to understand if a person really existed. And then you also want to maybe look how close was that person to the time that the person in question existed. So if Alexander the Great, for example, the first biography we have from him is 400 years later. So that is quite a gap. Tiberius, who was the Caesar at the time when Jesus was crucified, so both of them were actually the biggest rulers in the world. And yet Tiberius also, we only have about maybe 70, 80 years after his reign, we have the first manuscripts of his life. And so historians try to see how close can you get to the actual person, and the closer you get, the more reliable your source is. And now if you apply that criteria to Jesus, he's passing with flying colors. We have a dozen sources or so, many of them primary sources inside the Bible and outside the Bible. We have some of the things, especially, you read Corinthians 15, that portion of scripture here is pre-Pauline, so that means that even though Paul writes it about 58 AD, maybe 60 AD, most people recognize that actually because he says, I have passed on to you what I myself received, so it didn't originate with him, somebody else has said it before. So it's an oral saying that probably goes back maybe to almost 2 months within Jesus' death and resurrection time. So that's what D.G. Dunn said, who's a scholar here in Durham, and here in the UK. And if you consider those kind of things, you see the variety of different people that have written from different places, and without being aware of each other's writing, they're all saying roughly the same thing. You can say almost for certain that they didn't make it up. So it's like if you have an equation in math, and you find 2 different ways of solving the equation, and you come to the same result, you have a pretty good indication that you're right with your result. But if you find 8 or 10 different ways to solve it, you're absolutely certain or close to absolutely certain that it's right. And if you have those different independent sources talking about Jesus, and you have people, like I said, outside the Bible, you have somebody called Josephus who wrote about 95 AD. He talks about Jesus and John the Baptist, and he has no motivation to make that stuff up. You have Tacitus, who wrote about 110 AD, and he's talking about how Nero persecuted the Christians, how he burned them on sticks and so on, and almost in bypassing, he explains how the Christian faith came about, and that there was this Jesus, and that Pontius Pilate, one of his friends, crucified him, and so on. Bart Ehrman, who's an agnostic scholar of the Jesus Seminar, he wrote a book in 2012, and it's called Did Jesus Exist? And even though he's an agnostic, he says Jesus existed. And those people who deny it don't do so because they have looked at the evidence with the dispassionate eye of a scholar, but because they have some other agenda which this denial serves. And so, there used to be a time when it was just very popular to deny that Jesus lived. But if you do look at the evidence, again, I haven't, in the bit of research that I did leading up to this, I haven't found a single reputable scholar again, PhD and publishing in the field, who denies that. So this is really something we can take for granted.
I've heard the term embellished legend. Tell us a bit about that.
I mean, you can either mean two things by that. So either you mean that Jesus was just made up as a legend, and people just started, just started inventing him as a figure. But again, for a legend to develop, you need a certain amount of time, because people need to forget that what actually happened in those days. So if you wanted to invent a legend about you and I, you should at least wait until we're dead, and possibly until the children and so on have forgotten us. So so you need a certain time, probably around 1 to 2 generations, before you can actually invent a proper legend. Now again, we have source material that goes back to 2 months within Jesus' death and resurrection. That's just not enough time to make something up like that. And some people think it was easy back in the day to just make up a story, but that wasn't the case at all. I mean, people back then weren't stupid. We sometimes think everyone before the 18th century Enlightenment was kind of not smart, to say the least. But that's of course wrong. They knew dead people don't come back to life, and they knew if there was a Jesus figure that existed or not. So they checked and tried to get their facts straight as well. And the other thing is, there was a time in which not evangelical, but Protestant Lutheran theologians in Germany, so I think we're doing a bit of redemption here for our country. Some Lutheran liberal scholars called zeitgeschichtliche Religionswissenschaft. They tried to show that Jesus is actually a myth that was borrowed from the pagan, sort of from old pagan myths, and so the apostles were just making it up and borrowing things from various gods that were dead and rose again and so on, and that whole movement died within 30 years because it just had no foundation. It's interesting though that it's still around on the internet. So some people, and I suspect, and maybe I'm wrong, but I suspect rejecting Jesus as a historical figure is a very convenient way to get rid of him for people. If you don't want to engage with Jesus, and if you're afraid that once you admit that he was an actual person, you might have to deal with the claims that he made. I think that's what a lot of people fear, and so it's a very convenient way to say he was only a myth or a legend. But again, you can say that, but you must know that you're speaking against clear evidence and against the vast majority, and I'm talking 90% plus of the scholars.